Annabelle.
We are talking Winterskin. This one is directed and written by Charlie Steeds and stars David Lenik and Rowena Bentley. Now this is easily a comparison to the movie Misery because the plot here is very, very similar with kind of added B-movie schlock. The story focuses on this young guy who is out hunting in this kind of snowy woodland area with his father. He gets separated from his father and ends up at this kind of very remote cabin in this snowy wilderness. Now he's just kind of investigating when he actually gets shot through the door. Now the inhabitant of this cabin is this sort of strange woman who claims that there is some type of creature or creatures out in the kind of the snowy wilderness, and she's ultimately trying to defend herself. So she kind of takes this guy and kind of bandages him up, tries to kind of heal him, and of course he thinks she's a bit nuts. Now as the movie progresses and we kind of learn what's going on, there is some type of darker situation at hand here. What will actually happen, you'll have to watch the movie to find out. Suffice it to say, there are a few twists and turns. So let's talk about Winterskin, and first of all, what works with Winterskin. One thing I would say may not jump out at you when I kind of give you that description, but this film is extremely violent and very graphic in its depictions of people getting injured. I wasn't really, when you think about Misery, obviously there's the famous scene where the people, you know, the kind of the foot gets broken, etc. But it's more a psychological horror, and there is elements of that in this movie, but it's also, there is a lot of violence in this movie. There is actually a surprising amount of high body count in this film. And not only that, it's the way that the shots here of people getting killed, mainly through gunshots, is very graphic. And this is not a film where it kind of, the camera turns away. You see it in all its gory detail. And it really shows you that gunshots can be very horrific. I mean, there's shotguns, there's kind of, you know, regular bullets, and they all will rip through people and, you know, make a big old mess ultimately. And the movie does not shy away from showing you this. But it's not only that, there are some other kind of like quite kind of gruesome scenes as well. So this movie has a lot of blood, it has a lot of puke. Oh yes, there's a whole lot of puking in this movie. So if you're a kind of a gore fan and a kind of fan of kind of more violent films, I mean, it's not violent all the way through, but there are scenes here where I feel are particularly shot in a way that seem very brutal and very kind of well done, and it's to the point where it's kind of, you know, somewhat shocking in a kind of a B-movie schlocky way. I have to say I thought the soundtrack here was also excellent, kind of really kind of helps the movie in kind of some of its dramatic moments. And obviously having this kind of snowy sort of setting does give it a certain kind of a visual uniqueness, and it really does look cold, down to the fact where it's obviously shot, you know, even the interiors, you can see the kind of the people's breath in front of them, so you really do get the impression that the characters are really out in this kind of like this very cold environment. And there are a few kind of twists and turns here, and kind of like directions where you think it's going to zig and it's going to zag. I don't think that the twists are somewhat kind of obvious, to be honest. I don't think you have to, you know, you can kind of see some of it coming, but nevertheless they are there. And it doesn't kind of, not necessarily for some people at least, it won't be sort of as straightforward as it sort of seems. I actually quite like David Lenik's character. I thought he was going to play quite well, and you know, he's kind of like, things are revealed even with his character as the kind of the movie progresses. And to be fair, considering this is mainly takes place in one kind of location within this cabin with a kind of a few exterior shots, I have to say the movie was relatively well paced. What doesn't work? Okay, so I will say, if you're expecting a lot of these skinless creature bits with this movie, it's a relatively minor part of this film. That there is obviously scenes with that, but don't be expecting that to be the bulk of the story here, because it really isn't. This is more or less kind of a very kind of comparable film to Misery, and it really follows that kind of plot thread more than anything else. It's not quite the same, especially as we go off towards the end of the movie. There's almost a darker turn to it to some degree, but like if you're expecting creature features and stuff like that, then you may be a little bit disappointed. I have to say, I thought some of the acting here was a little weak. Our central two characters, the guy I thought is played relatively well. The crazy old woman acts crazy, but sometimes a little OTT. Now you can kind of maybe say that's kind of, obviously she's meant to be kind of a little bit nuts and a little bit kooky, so you can kind of write that off to a certain degree. However, there are a few supporting characters, and whenever these guys come on screen, the acting gets a little bit cringe, I have to say. But not just the acting, the dialogue. The dialogue is horrible from those characters, and the acting for them is quite poor. So whenever we do have other actors on the screen, it unfortunately doesn't really kind of, you kind of come out of it, because the acting is quite poor. This movie also feels like there's not a real lot of setup here. Now this is partly for the reason I think there's a couple of reveals that come throughout the movie, but it doesn't, it just seems like when the guy gets kind of separated from his father, it just seems to the father turns around and says, "Oh, don't wander off," and he literally wanders off a second later. So some of the writing here is a little bit kind of bare bones, shall we say, and could have been expanded a little bit upon that. And I have to be honest, although I think this movie is somewhat well made, it is very, very similar to Misery, to the point where I feel this almost can be classed a little bit of a plagiarism type sort of thing here, and obviously that's based on a Stephen King. Like I said, it does go in some different directions, but it's very similar. But yeah, it's quite surprising how violent this movie was, and those scenes are when they are there, they are very impactful, and there are some very kind of like gross out moments and some kind of like surprises, although I think you can kind of see a lot of them coming. So overall, I would say this movie is worth a watch. Certainly if you are a kind of a horror fan and you like Misery, but you also kind of like your gore and violence films, then this may be the perfect movie for you. So I'll give this one a 6 out of 10. But some of that ropey acting really kind of knocked this movie down for me. 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to you next time. Bye for now.